says it's trying. Okay, after a little technical glitch there, I think we have gone live. So hello, welcome to the Sunday evening. What day is it? Sunday evening, Tales from the Triptych. This is Trusty, aka Patrick, here on Trusty Huckster Mercantile. Thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's edition of Tales from the Triptych. I am joined this evening by the rest of the Triptych. I've got both Katie from Vintage and Vinyl. Hello, Katie.
Hello, guys. Welcome to the Triptych. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I am really looking forward to this exciting tale because Tucker had some really cool cars.
Yeah, this was a fun one to do some research and prep for. So I appreciate that. So looking forward to doing this as well. And the third part of the Triptych, we've got Nate coming in from New Zealand. How you doing tonight, Nate?
Great. Hot, melting hot.
Yeah, that other side of the hemisphere thing.
Yeah, nice to be here. Nice to see you, Patrick, Katie, and everyone.
I think when I logged on, my computer said it was 22 degrees, and now as it's moved, it now is just showing a snowman, which concerns me. I'm not sure why my little computer program has changed from a temperature to a snowman. So we'll see what that means. But we are here tonight, as the image shows you, and as Katie mentioned, we are here. I'm telling the tale of Tucker Automobile. So I'm actually going to start really quick with Nate. I don't think any of these have ever left the country. So I'm curious, have you ever even heard of a Tucker Automobile?
No, never. I'm a non-driver, so that really wouldn't be surprising. But no, I've never heard of Tucker before.
All right, excellent. Well, I will say I've definitely never driven one of these, but it's one of those cases, and I will be talking about this evening. I became aware of this as a result of a movie, the Jeff Bridges movie that was made, and I have watched it literally dozens of times. It's a really entertaining film, and as anything Hollywood, it's going to simplify things or make things maybe a little bit more interesting for the film. A lot of it is true, but I did have fun kind of figuring out where the differences were. So this is what we're going to be covering tonight. But before we get into that, I always like to figure out who's joining us for the evening. So Katie, who do we got in the chat tonight?
We've got Carrie, Tim, and Brian. Amy B is here. Peterson is here. Nate, who else do we have in the chat?
We have My Flea Market Treasures is here. Our Young Star Girl is here as well. Cheryl Ross is here. Hello, Cheryl Love.
Excellent. Well, so let's say, so Cheryl's coming in from Canada. So I don't know if any of these ended up in Canada either. So I'd be curious, Cheryl, if you were familiar with Tucker, probably more as a concept as opposed to something that I don't know if they would ever have been sold or tried to be sold in Canada. But I'm going to cover a lot of what the Tucker Corporation ended up doing for those of you who are not familiar with it. This is an image of Preston Tucker, and this is an image of two of his Tucker, what originally were promoted as Tucker Torpedoes. But again, as I mentioned before, this was right after, or I was talking to Nate earlier, this is right after World War II when all of this was happening. So the promotional literature and some of the references were calling it the Tucker Torpedo, and they determined that that was probably too much of a remembrance of World War II. So they actually moved away. And so when you get into any sales literature or anything specific, it became known as the Tucker 48, which is the model year they were being produced. So I'm going to be talking about Tucker Torpedo, Tucker 48. I will say, as you get into doing research, particularly as we talk about the collecting aspect of this, Tucker 48 is very hard to search under because you get almost anything with the name Tucker and then, anything that happened in the year 1948. So Tucker Torpedo tends to be a little bit more descriptive, but just know that there is a slight difference between the two. So in order to talk about the Tucker Automobile Corporation, we need to talk about Preston Tucker himself. Really briefly, because it is somewhat of note. Preston Tucker was born in 1903. I found it interesting, on a peppermint farm. Now, I only found that interesting because I didn't know peppermint was farmed. So he was born on a peppermint farm in Capac, and I apologize to all my Michiganders, Capac, Michigan, which is about 60 miles outside of Detroit. So we are at the early part of the 20th century. He is outside of what would become the largest manufacturing center in America for automobiles. And he did end up growing up in Lincoln Park, which is a community within Detroit. So he learned to drive at the age of 11, which I found that it's like just a statement. It said he learned to drive when he was 11, but if you do the math, that means he learned to drive in 1914. So probably a very different type of automobile that he was learning to drive at that time. But his early life basically revolved around a lot of things to do with cars. He actually worked as a messenger boy for Cadillac. As he got older, he started flipping cars and selling used cars. He ended up in Indianapolis and was designing motor speed cars with Henry Miller, who's a famous designer of race cars. So he did a lot of things in his early years, all related to automobiles. In 1923, he did marry Vera. She is a strong. If you're familiar with the movie, most of what I'm going to share will pretty much jive along with the movie. So Vera did become his wife in the movie, played by Joan Allen, one of my favorite actresses. But they married in 1923, and then they did settle outside of Detroit in Ypsilanti. And he kind of got some of his money. He always struggled with money, one of those cases where you bring a lot of money in, but that just means you start spending it on top of it. But he actually developed a patent in 1937, kind of dust off your history books. In 1937, things were happening in Europe that really we weren't acknowledging here in the United States. He was, doing the research. He was reading the newspaper articles. He was recognizing that war was on the horizon. So he started playing around with the idea of what could be improved upon from what was available in World War I. If it was needed in World War II. So in 1937, he designed basically it's a small tank that had a turret in it. And he presented it to the War Department. They didn't like the tank aspect of it. This is actually referred to in the movie. It drove too fast. It was a 10,000 pound tank, but it drove too fast. And so they didn't trust that it would be safe enough, but they loved the turret. So they put in a huge war. The government was building for stuff. So as we got closer and then entered the war, he made a lot of money on the turret. So he had a production facility. He had a lot of contracts coming in. So he had a lot of money to kind of play around with to determine what did he want to be when he grew up? What did he want to do next? And almost all indications of Preston Tucker indicated he was always not always in a positive way. People would just say he was always a dreamer. In some cases, they felt he was a huckster, which maybe that's why I'm drawn to this. But he was always thinking what was next. And what became next is he started recognizing that from 1942 to 1946, no new American car design were manufactured. Steel was being, rationed for the war effort. And once we did finally enter World War II, the automobiles, a lot of the production lines were converted to manufacture things for the war effort, including his turrets. So he was recognized as they went through World War II. He still had this love of automobiles that, once you got out of World War II, and this is also, again, it's referenced in the movie. And it's I can't remember where the quote came from, but he kind of references it. His philosophy was, if you finally get to buy a car once the war ends, do you want to buy a car that your father drove, or do you want to buy something that looks better? And so he did a concept drawing in 1945. And this is an image of Preston Tucker with the prototype, with just the concept car, just the illustration. And in January of 1946, he did a full page ad in Pick magazine showing the car. And you can see these are all just drawings. There's no photograph. This car did not exist. This was in his head. It was just, this is the idea. And he had some very cool ideas. One of which, and this is actually really important when you get into the idea, if you decide to start collecting or you're reselling anything to do with Tucker, the original prototype has a center steering wheel. That was one of the designs. So it wasn't practical. And so when they actually produced it, even the very first prototype that they built from scratch, they could not reproduce this concept. So what you need to recognize is in some cases, there's a very strong value to the earliest versions of this car, anything that was promoting it. There aren't a lot of ads that were done, but he did do this ad. It was the January 1946 issue of Pick magazine, which interestingly enough was targeted for a YA audience. So a young male audience, because he figured this was the sexy kind of car that people were going to go after. And he just introduced, and some of it was outlined right here within, the mechanics of how it was being designed. It was put right into the original ad, even though it was just conceptual. This is what the car ended up looking like. So it changed the fenders, that moved the steering wheel back. So these ended up being some of the patents that he actually did end up filing a little bit later once it was finalized. But it had suicide doors for the back, for the rear seat. It had a padded dash. This is the original drawing. Again, here's the central steering wheel. So when you opened the door, the side, you had passengers on either side of you as the driver. So when you open the door, the seat would swivel back so that the driver could get in and sit in the middle. So that was, one of the concepts, which again did not actually get implemented. But if you find original drawings, they'd only be drawings, they never existed. So there would be no photographs. But if you find original advertisements or any sketches or illustrations of this design, it did end up getting implemented in a different type of car that had nothing to do with Tucker. So this concept did existing. But if it's tied to the Tucker, it would have been from its very original concept, and would definitely have some value, because this design was ditched very quickly because it simply couldn't be done. One of the things for the car was a rear engine, which was not common in the day. And as a result, that meant the trunk, the engine went in the trunk, and that meant the hood, when it popped open, was your storage area. And this luggage actually has a story in and of itself that I'll share in a little bit. But so just a completely different look, it was much wider than most of the larger cars that were available. And initially they had hoped to do it as a what do you call the two-door, a coupe. But they only ever made it in a sedan, and they also never made it as a convertible, and that comes into play later as well. What I have here, and I turned the sound off, so hopefully I do not get demonetized for showing a video, but this is a video from Barrett-Jackson. If anyone's familiar with Barrett-Jackson, they're, I think this was like their 50th anniversary or something like that. They were kind of doing a showcase of their top selling cars. And this is in 2012, they sold the 43rd car ever made by Tucker. And I will back up and say, and I'll go into this a little bit more detail, but depending on how you define it, there were only ever 50 or 51 cars manufactured. So this is what number 43. And what this does is they come in and look, just the camera does a really nice job of showing a lot of the actual beauty of this car. So we'll start it out. So right off the bat, you've got this Cyclops headlight. I'm loving the hood ornament, that mascot. I would take that home any day. Yep. The Cyclops, actually, the headlight turned when you turn the steering wheel. I'll show you that. You can see the suicide door for the back, these huge fenders that were built in. They've got the back pop, so you'll see the trunk with the rear mounted engine. And this car ended up selling for $2.9 million. So this car, even in 2012, this car does still hold the record for the most expensive Tucker ever sold. So this is it's just a great, seeing it this close. I've got a lot of stills that I'll show you, but showing it this close, it's a gorgeous car. And because there are so few made, that makes them very collectible. It makes them very desirable. And they're also very trackable, and I'll go through that as well. There's not a lot of mystery out there, so you kind of know what you're getting into. So a lot of the designs was how did it look, but he also introduced a bunch of safety stuff, and one of them was that Cyclops steering wheel. So in the initial design, when he did the original diagram, and you kind of see it in the ad, you can see these fenders look like they're not attached. And it's because they weren't. Originally, when you turn the steering wheel, the fenders turned. But They determined that at a high speed, it meant that the entire front of your car was no longer aerodynamic. And it would it would be dangerous. So they modified it. Alex, he's referenced in the movie. Oh, now I didn't write down his name, but he ended up being a designer that came in and kind of helped make this fantasy car, which effectively is what this is. The Torpedo is really just a fantasy, made it into a production level car. And the way they adapted it was to make the fenders stationary, but turn the headlight so that as you're turning your car, your headlight will actually illuminate what you're seeing as you turn. And it's actually, that triggered a whole set of research as well, that headlights weren't actually particularly common in the 40s because they were expensive. The bulbs didn't last very long. So a lot of cars didn't have headlights, which I found fascinating. So the fact that he had these like super advanced headlights was even a better, development into safety.
And it seems like he has 3 headlights on there.
Yeah, so you still have the 2 that these would stay, like these would become your normal ones, like the 2 at the side. And so it was just that third one that was the one that only turned. So yeah, so this 3 headlamp design was not really replicated any other time. These cars are very, very identifiable. Once you know what it looks like, whether you see a ad for it, a photo of it, or a Hot Wheels, you will know that is a Tucker. They're pretty easy to pick out. And
was there a Tucker Hot Wheels?
There is, and I will share that with you in a little bit. The other thing, he was very big into safety, and there's a couple of good stories about it, and some of this is reflected in the movie because these are all real things. But one of the things that he really tried to do, so this is a padded dashboard, which was not a common thing for cars at the time. And you also see there's a very open wheel well here. This padding, that was actually a safety innovation that he had created and implemented for the cars. He also had 4-wheel independent suspension with disc brakes at all 4 corners. Now, I basically just wrote down what I read because I barely understand that sentence, but I understand that that's a fairly significant thing. So I guess either disc brakes weren't common yet, or they weren't common on all 4 brakes or all 4 wheels. So that was another thing that he had done. He also this was one of the cars that was manufactured. They were doing a test run on it and it flipped. Now, this is also represented in the movie because it's a fairly significant component. It was a legitimate accident. When they did the investigation afterwards, what they determined was it was being tested at high speed on purpose. But when they had come in for the last pit stop, they inadvertently filled it with aviation fuel instead of gasoline. And it ended up causing the engine to stall as it was entering a turn. And as he was trying to recover the fact that it was stalling, he overcompensated and it blew out a wheel. And it flipped the car 3 times. One of the safety innovations is right here. The windshield was a pop-out windshield. So instead of him hitting the windshield or going through the windshield and being shattered with glass, the windshield actually popped out and the guy was totally fine. He bruised his elbow was all. Now, he probably wouldn't have even bruised his elbow if the last safety invention was kept. And this is covered in the movie as well. And this is one of the pieces that I didn't realize it. It's an argument in the movie. Well, it turns out Tucker lost the argument. Tucker wanted to add seatbelts. Seatbelts were not common at that time. They kind of some people kind of had them, but they really weren't a thing. Volvo is actually credited for the first seatbelt, but not until 1958. And what was happening was Tucker wanted to have these seatbelts installed, and the marketing department determined that indicated the car was not safe.
Wow.
That if you needed a seatbelt, it meant that your car was dangerous, and therefore they wouldn't sell it to a family. And this was obviously of a size, it was being sold as a family car. Even though initially it was sold for a younger audience, the price point and the size of it became a family car. And they felt that the seatbelts would be would indicate it was dangerous. So this accident occurred without the guy having seatbelts, yet he still came out almost unscathed because the car just had all the padding and on the instruments, there were no protruding parts. I don't really know what used to protrude, but that was also one of the things I found in the research, that in some cases, I guess some of the dashboards of other automobiles just had like big, I don't know, wooden stakes sticking out of it. I don't know, something that would kill people when they hit the dashboard. So he did everything to simplify the dashboard, and then he actually padded it so that if somebody did smash into the dashboard, that it would help and not be injured as much. So
it's interesting, Patrick, because that car doesn't have a glove box, and I'm curious to when those were invented.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, all of the instruments are on the side, and there's actually several ads. Several of the advertisers. I don't know if any of that I kept, but there's one that shows in the movie, and I was coming across them. But it's funny that you say that. A lot of the ads show a small child sitting down here.
Wow.
I don't know why. I don't know if that's supposed to be, if you have a family of 7, that's where the 7th one goes, or if that's it. Kind of like sometimes it was referenced with the safety, because that's how you would see the like even in the movie, the little actress that they recreated the advertisement with, she actually reaches up and feels that to indicate it's padded. So I don't know. It's like, so if you smash into the dashboard, you could then crumple into a pile underneath. I don't know. But I mean, with older cars, they were a lot simpler because they didn't have all the electronics and things. But you're right. There's really nothing. There's no little compartment on the side. There's actually something over here. Yeah. I don't know how big that would have been. I mean, it's in the door, so maybe that would have held something. Here's the little ashtray, so you'd be able to smoke, because that would be very important. So yeah, so there is that opening gap. I just don't know if that portion was an innovation or if that's relatively common. So one of the things that's discussed in the movie, and I did find it interesting, and it is somewhat significant, if you ever find yourself in the market to buy a Tucker. Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh, but who knows who my audience is. Hello, Jay Leno. If you are ever in the market to find a Tucker, it is important to know that the Tucker was only ever produced in 6 colors. It was produced in black, waltz blue, and this is actually a line in the movie. Waltz blue was the color of one of Vera's dresses. So it's waltz blue, green, beige, pearl gray, and maroon. Those are the only 6 colors. You will see, and when I cover this in the collecting side, there are a lot of cars that now have other colors, including a fire engine red. All of those have been repainted. Now, it's understandable that a car of this age, that's going to sell for multi-million dollars, you don't want a rusty old paint job on it. But if it's being repainted in a color that was not one of the original 6, you need to be aware that there were only 6 colors that started out. Well, not quite the Model T where you could have any color you wanted as long as it was black, but you could only have the 6 colors that were offered here. And the first car that ended up being produced was a prototype, which was pretty much made from, you hate to say scraps, but it was made from repurposing other types of automobiles and other types of chassis and rebuilding around it, which also is what limited some of the production because they were trying to retrofit parts. We're not too far after the years of the war. The one thing that the movie tends to do, which has been pretty much overruled if you do research since that time, a lot of people have done academic studies of the movie that implies it was the big 3 automakers that put Tucker out of business, and that they were putting restrictions on their suppliers to say, if you supply Tucker, we won't buy from you. That was kind of the implication being made in the movie. It has since been proven that did not happen, but it was real that materials were at a premium simply because you're only a couple of years past World War II. So we've maybe got away from the rationing, but now there's only so much steel to go around. And if you have the ability to sell to a multi-billion-dollar car manufacturer or the Tucker Corporation that hasn't built a car yet, you're probably going to fill your quota with a guaranteed payment and not some upstart. So there's some rationale to that, but the fact of the matter is the first car was manufactured pretty much by scratch and went on display in Chicago, June 19th, 1947. That date does carry some significance, as well as Chicago, because again, as we get into collecting, he started outside Michigan, primarily in Ypsilanti. When they started technically, quote unquote, producing the Tucker automobile, they moved to Chicago. So if you find any advertising, any brochures, anything that references Ypsilanti, that's going to be earlier than something that references Chicago. So I'm going to show you some of the ads. So this happens to be, and this is actually, I'm showing it here, but I'm going to talk about it again later. This is the magazine that had the first ad for Tucker. So again, it's the magazine for young men. It's Pick Magazine, January 1946. I'll tip my hand. I will just say what's important to note, that this is the issue and this is the cover. The person that sold this, you can see this is in Worth Point. The person that sold this did not recognize that the Tucker ad was in it, and it only sold for $10.
Wow.
Tucker ads themselves, torn out of other magazines, have sold for hundreds of dollars. You need to know what you have. So if you are ever on, going out and you just see a stack of Pick magazines and they're being sold for a nickel a piece, because who wants a magazine for young men? Dive for the January 1946 issue. Dive for this cover, because this issue is futures in the air. It's all about the future. And there was that ad that I showed you earlier is actually in this magazine, this ad. So this is what you're going to be on the lookout for. If it's been torn out, this is the earliest reference to the car. Again, it looks a little bit different, but that actually adds to its significance, because this image only existed for about a year. So if we kind of go into the timeline, the art was done in late 1945. This was the January 1946 issue. He then produced or unveiled the prototype in June of 47. So at the longest, you would have had basically 46 and maybe early 47, where they still weren't 100% what it was going to look like, but they did start changing some of the ads. So if you see this type of design in this issue, that's the important one. Also, once it got changed to being called Tucker 48, this one didn't really call it anything. So when it starts being called Tucker 48, that makes it a little bit later. And unfortunately, it's a little bit hard to read, but this does have a Chicago with a 2-digit zip code. So again, this ad is going a little bit later but the big thing that they were referencing, and some of it came back to bite him, 15 years of testing. Well, let's all do the math. He drew a picture of it in 1945 and then actually put something on display a year and a half later in 47. So how could it even possibly have had 15 years of testing? So that was somewhat of a misnomer. So that's significant. There are publications out there from the Tucker Corporation that would have gone to the dealers. So this is, what does it say? Tucker dealers to offer first completely new car in 50 years. This 50 years thing also became a repetitive advertising ploy. So yes, there was no new models between 42 and 46, but if you go back to 1898, I'm sorry, there have been, if you look at a car that was released in 1898, it looked very different than 1948, but so did 1918. So that the first new car in 50 years is also, that's just an absolute fantasy as well. So a lot of these things kind of went back to bite him in the butt, but it worked on the marketing side. Because even as Nate and I and Katie and I were talking earlier, there's some things we're like, well, why were people trying to buy these if they didn't exist and they couldn't see it in person? They were sucked in by the advertising. This guy was a brilliant huckster, and whether he was purposely trying to be fraudulent, or just trying to launch what could have been the biggest car manufacturer ever, it's still kind of a mystery. But so these exist because unlike and this is where the movie started kind of straying a little bit. Again, if you do some of the math, and I'll kind of go into this as we talk about the investors, but the company existed a little bit longer than the movie seemed to indicate. So the cars were manufactured in 1947. He wasn't investigated by the SEC until May of 1948. So he actually had almost a year to be producing cars and promoting them legitimately, before the SEC started investigating him. So there were people that were signing up for dealerships. There were people, and there was actually in the, it wasn't in the movie, but in the trial transcripts, one of the people that was called by the government to testify against Tucker had actually already received one of the Tucker automobiles and told the court that it was one of the best automobiles he'd ever driven. So like the government called the guy in to kind of throw Tucker under the bus, and the guy's like, I love him. It's like, why would I do that? So the cars were actually in circulation even at the time he was being tried for fraud. So, so some of the math doesn't add up in the movie, and that's why this was fun to investigate. So these are not rare, but they're not common either, because there actually were a lot of dealers, and they existed for a while. Even though they didn't have a lot of cars to sell, they did exist. Some of their brochures, in my opinion, from just a design, are some of the most beautiful. Like just the Tucker emblem, they're just some of the most beautiful pieces of ephemera out there. I would love to have a Tucker sales brochure in my collection. I mean, it'd be a perfect addition to my Huckster collection. But it's the first completely new car in 50 years. I mean, they really pushed that to try and get people to say, yeah, I need to buy a car that's different than my dad. That was their whole thing. A completely new car. Again, it's just a repeated thing that just comes up all the time. The most talked about automobile in the world. So this was a brochure this is from the original concept art. So this is where it's still originally being called the Tucker Torpedo. So this wasn't the ad. This was someplace else. And unfortunately, there was no reference to where this came from. So this exists in the wild. Even the woman standing next to it matches the concept art that he showed in that first picture. I just don't know if this was in a brochure or if this was an ad. So it was sold on eBay, but there was no reference to where it came from. So again, but that's how you can kind of know whether you've got an older one. It calls it Torpedo, and this is one, it's a little bit harder to tell, but this one you can see the fenders are still very different. It's a lot pointier in the front than it became. It highlighted the rear engine. So a lot of their ads did end up going into technical journals and highlight some of the engineering changes and some of the safety changes. So it's got the pop-out windshield. Really trying to attract people that this, again, it's a totally new car. So they were trying, even if people didn't understand it, they were trying to say, like, this is why this is different. I mean, why do you need a display of electricity? But it looks cool. So if you're looking for a new car, hey, look at that. That's fun. Do I get that in my car? So, they had great marketing. So things like this pop up a lot because, and this is referenced again in the movie, and this is where sometimes you need the timeline to go along with it. They were producing, or in the plans for producing these cars for about a year before things started falling apart. So this is from the New York Museum of Science and Industry promoting that the car was coming. They had a schedule, and they were delivering this car to all these different places around the country to showcase, look how great this car is, so people could see it in person. The car existed. The movie makes it seem like they only went on tour with the prototype, but I will show you an image coming up that shows that is not the case. They actually had manufactured multiple cars, and they were sending them along with the prototype so that everyone can see the different colors and everything that was available. So there's a lot of stuff like this where, in big cities where it was going to be some sort of a demonstration or a display, and you were being invited to it. So those are definitely going to have some value. Again, a lot of stuff focusing on the safety. And then this is just the color rendition of the Tucker, that this just shows up. If you ever see this on something that's hard to read, or on metal pieces, some of the collectible pieces that are out there just have this engraved into it that were gifts to dealers and things like that, is, recognize it, because that is definitely going to have some value.
Now, George, the Antique Nomad, is in the chat, and he is commenting something I find fascinating. He says in the movie, they wrecked a lot of 1950s Studebakers because they were easy to doll up and look like the Tuckers.
Oh, interesting. That I'm not to manufacture them as Tuckers, or people started doing that in the 50s after the Tucker died out.
for the movie to make them look like
Oh,
Tucker.
okay. Well, they did have a couple of legitimate Tuckers, but you also figure if even back at that time, they were probably over $1 million a piece. Even Francis Ford Coppola didn't have the money to get all of them. But I did not know that that's how they filled it. I never really thought about it to figure out where they were getting the bodies of those. So that's actually really interesting. And it is, I highly recommend watching the movie. It's even just for the sheer entertainment value. It's a good movie. It's got Jeff Bridges and Joan Allen, which are, great actress. And it does share a really interesting story. And it's actually funny. There's great humor in it. But it's kind of like a David and Goliath type story that may technically not have been true as you get to the truth. But it's got some great eye candy, some great vintage eye candy in there. Okay, so we were doing all the advertising. This is where the timeline starts getting a little bit confusing, and I tried to figure out the best way to talk about this. But the general gist, and this is definitely referenced in the movie, is they needed to have a place to manufacture the car. And they ended up finding a location and ended up being a former it was a plane factory in Chicago. It was it was one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world. And he actually ended up buying this for the Tucker, or getting it for the Tucker Corporation, and leasing it from the government. As part of the requirements, in order to prove that they were a legitimate production company, they had to have assets of at least $15 million. They needed to produce at least 50 cars by a certain period of time. And they needed to take possession by a certain date. Now, a lot of things did not get covered in the movie. The date didn't happen. He didn't have the initial down payment for the lease. There ended up being a lot of things that had to be juggled around that the government actually were very flexible with. One of them, though, was the issue. He decided in order to have the assets, he needed to sell stock. And this goes back into like, okay, well, let's now look at a different point in time. I'm not particularly knowledgeable in stocks now, certainly not knowledgeable of stocks, post-war stocks, but the Security and Exchange Commission initially did not want him to sell stocks because he technically wasn't a company. He hadn't produced anything. So it was considered a speculative IPO, which evidently in 1947, looking at my dates here, in 1946 and 47, that was not common. It didn't seem like it was not that it didn't exist. It just seemed like it wasn't common. So the reason he couldn't make the initial payment was because the SEC stalled their permission to allow him to sell stock. And so they ended up giving him permission to sell stock. And then they also waived the first payment so that he could make some money by the time he did that. So he ended up selling $15 million worth of stock in the speculative IPO. But his first payment for the lease was $2.3 million. So right out of the gate, if you only sell $50 million, you didn't sell it on day one, he was already running against the clock of having additional money. So one of the things he also started selling were dealerships. Now, this is kind of skimmed over in the movie where they just talk about he just sold dealerships. What I discovered in doing the research, evidently at that time at least, it was not common to do that. That yes, there were Cadillac dealerships, yes, there were Chevy dealerships, but typically there were franchises and you had to meet certain requirements to have Chevy allow you to be a franchise. What Tucker was doing was, you write me a big enough check, I won't make you a franchise. There weren't any other conditions. It was all based on cash. The SEC did not like that, but they determined it was not illegal. It might have been considered unethical, but then you're back with the caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. These people are willingly buying and paying for these dealerships, even though the car didn't exist. They were still buying them or paying for the dealership, so they kind of let it go. And he made $6 million just selling dealerships for cars that did not exist.
Wow.
What does not get explained in the movie is that these dealers and distributors then were signed on for almost that entire year before the SEC did their final investigation, which meant they were invited to the factory. They got gifts. They got Christmas cards. They got stuff as a dealer and distributor because Tucker still, and people can argue this, but look, the glass is half full. He was intending to support all of his dealers. So it wasn't that they were being cheated. They were buying the dealership and they were just waiting for the cars. So there were investors that were specifically buying these dealerships, and they were continuing to buy dealerships right up until the time he was investigated by the SEC because, oh, hey, Jimmy down the street just signed for a dealership. I got to compete against that. I'm going to buy one too. So people were still buying them, even though that car, they had not produced, any significant car since that initial model got displayed in June of 47. This is actually a recreation, but I thought it was just a beautiful recreation. This is at the AACA Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So the Antique Automotive Club of America has a Tucker collection. And this is, you can see the Tucker emblem, the stickers. All of these items, this banner, these were all things you could get as a dealer that were legit, that you would get and you would have access to because you quote unquote purchased a dealership for a Tucker. So it may not have been common, but he was turning it into something, huckster or not. He raised $6 million. This is what I mentioned earlier. So he was trying to promote the car. This is how he was getting the dealerships. He was sending, and this is referenced very briefly, that we need to send Tucker on tour. Well, they make it seem like he's only on tour with the one car that he had produced. Well, look how many cars are on these trucks. So all of these cars were being distributed to that place in New York that said, hey, come see the car. It wasn't just one car. This was different colors. I don't know if they necessarily would have looked any different on the inside. I don't know if there were like what you could buy for the accessories. I didn't get into that. But I found this fascinating. So like even just driving down the road, you would see this huge double-decker car hauler that says right on here, these are Tuckers. And just from a glance, you'd be like, wow, I'd have never seen a car that looks like that. Now, it's not nearly as space age as the original one, but I'm sorry, I'll take it. I'll buy one. So I don't know why we don't make cars that look like that anymore. This is a really good example. Again, it's one of those cases I wouldn't have thought. This was the grand opening from Hargis Motor Sales. This guy bought a dealership and he was going to have a grand opening in October of 1948, which is when, in May was when they were shut down. So this guy had already bought the dealership. He'd already bought ads to say, come check out all of my cars. So, and right here, the first completely new car in 50 years. So this was I want to say I found this in New York, Harrison Avenue and County Highway, Riverhead. All right. I'm actually not sure. I want to say I had found a bunch of stuff about New York. So I think this was somewhere in New York, but I could be wrong. I don't know where Riverhead is, but I just found this fascinating. I did not know that dealerships, like they were promoting, like they were actually announcing, we are Tucker dealerships. And here's a picture of one. I found this fascinating that this existed. So this was a 1947 New York region Tucker sales and dealership, huge sign, all the bunting, everything ready. Orders will be taken now. They don't exist, but they were taking orders for it. And this is what I also found out. So they ended up having 129 New York dealerships, and those dealerships alone sold 24,000 Tucker cars.
Wow.
And this, I couldn't find a reference in, like it says here, the 24,000 represented 85% of the quota. I'm not 100% sure what the quota is. I don't know if that was the quota the government had then set for him to have enough cars manufactured, or if this was something else. I never found another reference to a quota. So this piece I'm not sure on, but just this alone was bringing in 24,000 pre-sold cars. And I will talk about it, some of what they did in order to pre-sell the cars. And this is of interest to people in the New York area, 2,100 of these were sold in Long Island. 17 dealerships just on the island of Long Island. 2,100 cars would have been sold just for Long Island. So Long Island has money now. It had money then. So
do any of those dealerships still exist today?
They probably exist under other, like in some cases, some of the ones that I found, like this one is saying it's just now a Tucker dealership, but in some cases they would have already sold like Studebaker or Cord or something like that. And they were just adding Tucker into the mix. So most of these, it wasn't like they didn't have any, they were never selling cars and suddenly they might have, but they typically weren't like, I've never sold a car before, but I'm going to have a Tucker dealership. It was, I'm already selling cars. I now want to sell these cool, sexy cars. And so they would just add to it. So this might have been like an extended location, or maybe like right next to it is a big Cadillac sign. So they were expanding to sell Tuckers, but yeah, so the dealerships probably still exist or possibly still exist, but just selling the cars that they originally had been selling. So again, oops, didn't mean to close that. But if you go back, the window I just inadvertently closed, it showed that they had sold, didn't close it. They'd sold 24,000 Tuckers. Well, one of the things you could do to buy a Tucker is he had a program, and it was the the Tucker accessory purchase program. And what it allowed you to do was purchase a radio or purchase luggage. So I'll have to go back to that since I've already closed it. You could purchase this luggage. You could purchase a radio. You could purchase a seat cover or a heater. You could pay for these up front, and then what that got you was a spot on the waiting list for the car. So the 24,000 cars, quote unquote, that they sold were actually 24,000 accessories that were sold in order to get them on a waiting list for the car. He raised $2 million just selling the accessories.
Is that totally kosher?
I'm sorry?
Is that totally kosher to do that? Or
nope. That is exactly what shut him down. That is what he got investigated for. The Security and Exchange Commission had already had him on the watch list because they were still a little unsure about the initials, the IPO, that whether that was legit, but they green lighted it. So they were already watching him. The dealerships concerned them, but they did kind of do an internal investigation and decided that really wasn't illegal. It was just, again, kind of a huckstery thing, but it wasn't fraud. This they determined was fraud. So on May 28th, 1948, they seized all of his documents. So at that, and then from May 1948 until January of 1949, they were still under production, but the factory was officially closed in January of 1949. By the time it closed, they had officially made 36 cars. They had already come off the line and had either been being delivered to somebody, they were in that tour that they had, or like it ended up going to the one car dealer that they had on trial. He had gotten one. So 36 had been delivered, but after January 1949, they were not indicted until October of 1949. So what they did from January 1949 to October, it's also worth mentioning at the time they were closed in January of 1949, the Tucker Corporation employed 1,600 people, 1,600 people, and they made 36 cars. So
there'd be significantly more of these radios and the sets of luggage than there would be cars.
Absolutely, because just in the state of New York alone, they sold 24,000 of something. So either the radio, the luggage, the seat covers, or the heater.
Did you find any of those items on the market or having been sold?
And I will show you that in a second.
Great.
Now, is the luggage actually marked Tucker?
You know what? It's not, which I found fascinating. I'm going to reopen the window that I inadvertently closed. See if I can get it open back up. The luggage does not have anything on here that says Tucker. There's no engraving. There's no embellishment. If you open it up, it just says who manufactured it. There's nothing to indicate that this was Tucker. So and to me, I think I've done community theater productions with suitcases that look just like this. So this is a standard shape. So I don't even know how you would know if you had a Tucker. And I found a couple of different photographs, and at no point could I figure out how to indicate that these were Tucker. They all had provenance of some sort that, basically indicated that, yes, these are, but no, there's nothing on here that would indicate. So the significant ones are things like the radio. This is what the radio looked like. It actually has Tucker built into the buttons, which is pretty damn cool. Because the car itself did not have a radio. So you have this, the car itself did not have a heater, but the heater just looks like a big brown box. It's not attractive. So you probably could see somewhere on the heater that says it's Tucker. But again, what's going to add to the collectability is if you still have the original box, because there's a Tucker emblem. It's got the Tucker name right across there. It's already got the Chicago name because they didn't start doing this until they left Ypsilanti. And that's how you can also sometimes, I don't think there's a lot of reproductions out there or anything fraud, but you have to make sure things piece together. At no point would they have had anything for the Tucker 48 that still would have had a Michigan address on it, because that didn't start happening until they moved to Chicago. So this was how they raised a lot of money. So the SEC raided in May of 1948, closed the factory in January of 1949. In January, it's a little bit unclear how exactly he did it. This is also referenced in the movie. All I could find as a reference was he kept a skeleton crew on hand to finish another 14. Because if you remember, one of the requirements was a $15 million assets and 50 automobiles. So he really wanted to make those other 14. So he actually had those manually manufactured, and they show that in the movie. What I'm unclear on is exactly when those were made, because the movie kind of contracts all of this. But at some point, they did roll another 14 off of the production line. So there was a total of 50 that were quote unquote produced. And then there was the original prototype. So the general number that you hear about when they talk about how many Tuckers exist, you're either going to hear 50 or 51. The prototype was manufactured in Chicago. The movie shows that it was manufactured in Michigan. It was not. So the original prototype was also manufactured in Chicago, but it didn't come off quote unquote the line. The line was being rebuilt because it was a airplane manufacturing facility at that time. So they were kind of making it off to the side. So it's a model number 1000. The first one that came off the line was model 1001. And the last one that came off was 1050. Although there's a little asterisk over my head as I say that, and I will explain that in a little bit. So there were 50/51 cars that came off production. They physically, they started the trial in October of 1949, and he was formally acquitted, found not guilty, along with 7 of his staff members were also tried. That's not covered in the movie either. They were all found not guilty in January of 1950. But by January of 1950, it was done. Like the factory had been closed. All the assets had been seized. The money was gone. They had nothing to show for it. So by the time he was found not guilty, the company was already defunct. So there was no real explanation of what happened to the money from the dealers, if that was put back into the manufacturing. The SEC was claiming that he was using the money for his personal gain, but that was never proven, and he was found not guilty. But there's no explanation of where the money, all that, this 15 plus the 6 plus the $2 million ended up going. But you end up having only 50 cars left on the market. And because it's such a well-defined market, they are very well documented. So this is the Tucker Automobile Club of America. Yes, there is such a thing. This is every car that came off the line. So the Tin Goose was the colloquial term for the original model that they kind of like chunked together with multiple parts. 1001 is the first one that came off the line. Look, it's fire engine red. Somebody repainted it. So why they would do that to the very first car produced, I have no idea, but whatever. It's pretty. So this is every car that has been produced. There's one missing, and I'll show you that in a second. 1043 is the one I showed you the video for. So this is the one that holds the record for the highest price right now at auction, $2.9 million. So 1050, this is the last car that came off the line, but you can see there's a 1051C and a 1052C, because what I did not know until I started doing the investigation is they produced 58 finished cars. But if you think about, how cars would have been manufactured somewhere along the line, they made the frames and the bodies, the chassis and the doors and the fenders and everything. they made enough to make 58. So there were a total of 58 skeletons that were out there. 50 of them got produced in the cars. And then when the company was folded, they did an assets auction to get rid of the rest of them. 1051 and 1052 were part of the asset auction. And somebody bought the bodies, they bought the chassis, they bought all the body parts, and then they finished it themselves. So 1051C is the continuation of the line. So that happened to be the 51st car that would have been made, but was not made as a Tucker. And then there's a 52C. So 2 of them got completed. I don't tend to count on Wikipedia for my information very often, but I never found this information recreated anywhere else. And this is fascinating. You got the image version in that on the last page, but when you go to the Wikipedia page, you can see all the numbers are right here. It actually tells you where every single one of them is. So the very first car is actually 0. I said it was 1,000. It's just 0. Is now in Huntington, Pennsylvania, and it talks about how that one was different. It's at the Swigert Antique Auto Museum. 1001, so that first one that's been repainted is currently at the Hershey Museum, AACA. It was previously owned. It gives information upon Kamak's death in 2003. His entire extensive Tucker collection was donated to the museum in Hershey. 10.2 is Clayton. You can see this column here. It's showing all the ones that are intact. 47 Tuckers are accounted for, but 1018 was destroyed. It was in an automobile accident, and some of the parts were rescued, but for that car no longer exists. 1023 was destroyed by a fire, and the remains were crushed in 1980 by its owner.
Oh, no. Founder
of the Tucker Automobile Club. Basically, probably just it's kind of like keeping the collection pure, getting the bad stuff. Because I mean, if this entire warehouse burned to the ground, that chassis would have been melted. It would have been in bad shape. So if it got reintroduced into the field, it would have damaged the reputation of the Tucker. So they destroyed it. So that one's gone. 1027 is gone. Also through it. That was the accident. That was the one that was doing the test. So that was the one that rolled over in 1948. So they never rebuilt that one. We've got one undergoing restoration in Brazil. So actually one did leave the country. And Memphis, there was another one. I've never heard of a Bash a Tucker fundraiser, but evidently there was something that called that maybe this got destroyed in that one, and they found the remains of it. And so part of it's on display at the Hershey Museum, but the car itself is no longer in place. So this accounts for all the 50 that were produced, but then it also goes into that continuation. So the 51 and 52 are the 2 that I just showed the pictures of. So one's in Butler, New Jersey, one's in Aurora, Indiana, and it talks about how those got completed. 53, 54, 55, and 56 are missing. So like you won the golden ticket if you can find the remains of 53, 54, 55, and 56. Actually, 54 was used to finish 51. So 54 is no longer available. There's one intact here, and then 58 was unknown. So like the absolute holy grail unicorn, you want to send me friend mail, this is what you're looking for. These are the most valuable Tucker collections out there. Would obviously be an actual Tucker. But in a real world, the Tucker Torpedo, and again, I mentioned earlier, when you're searching for Tucker Torpedo is a little bit easier to find, but it's worth searching for Tucker 48 and some of the variations of Tucker Corporation. So you can even see here, like I got some Civil War book came up with a Tucker Torpedo. But there are a couple things that pop up a lot, and this is one of them. It's an ashtray that was given as a gift to dealerships. So again, there could be thousands of these out there, but if you had a Tucker dealership and then you felt like you got scammed, you lost thousands of dollars buying a dealership that didn't come to fruition, would you keep this as a memento, or would you hide it because you'd be ashamed that you wasted your money and that you did a bad business deal? So these aren't as common as you would think. So this one just sold a couple months ago for $2,600, and it's simply an ashtray with a Tucker model sitting on top of it. So we've got that one. This one sold for $1,500, but that was all the way back in 2013. The other thing that exists, and these are going to be a lot harder to find. I'm just going to show you a closer up of the Tucker ashtray. This one's going to be a little bit harder to find because you need to know that they exist, and it's the manufacturing license plates that were issued for the first cars that were coming out. Now, this is for issue number 81. They never made 81 cars. So this, and it actually is explained in the description, these are unused. They're still in the original paper folder that was sent to the factory to get put onto a car. So these just never got used. And so they're black with the orange numbering. And I think they ended up going up to 100. I think I found another reference that said they ended up pre-ordering 100 of them. And if you look, there it is. So this was the 17th license plate. You can see it's a lot smaller. Now, this might be what the standard, I'm assuming this is what the standard size license plate was in Illinois in 1948. I'm guessing. I can't imagine they would have had a different size license plates. But you figure if steel was being rationed, you might think they were a little bit smaller. There was a time that actually Illinois license plates were made out of crushed soybeans until all the goats started eating them. So, they're just smaller. And I didn't make that up. That's actually true. So there are going to be a handful of the license plates out there, but they don't say Tucker on them. They were just license plates. So this one, though, is special because it had the, I don't know why they didn't take a picture of it, but it actually, you can see in the background, there's the paper. It's the envelope that it was shipped to the Tucker organization in. That's why it earned $2,400, because it proved that these were part of the Tucker. If you now know, though, if you ever come across an Illinois 48 license plates and it's under 100, or God help you, if it's under 50, you have found your own golden ticket that is going to sell for big bucks, but no one's going to know it until you find this kind of evidence and you sell it with this story being attached to it. So people know that that's what it is. Again, this is that January 1946 issue, $10, 2017, got it $10. He doesn't even list that Tucker ad is in here. He did not know what he had. All he talks about here is that he had an entire stack of Pick magazines and he was selling them all for $10. So
wow.
He didn't look. So it's one of those, like, knowledge is power. That's why we do these. That ad would be worth big bucks if you found it. Because actually, I go back to worth.
And it really teaches you to look in old magazines.
Yep.
And not just skim over, because there's a lot of value to some of those old ads sometimes.
Absolutely. So let's see if I can get the page to reload. Like, this is an entire collection of, so you get a stock certificate, some of the ads, one of the ashtrays. This sold for $1,600. I want to say there were a couple of ads that I found on here, but I don't think I highlighted them. I apologize. Like the brochure, just the initial brochure sold for $1,800. Now this is why I mentioned it. This is the Torpedo brochure. This is the early one. This is the one with, see, the fenders are separate again. Like, this is what you got to know what the car ended up looking like to realize. And also, this is a coupe. There was never a coupe manufactured. So if you see a coupe, you see the fenders split, you see it called a Torpedo, that's how you're going to get $1,800 for a brochure. So you wonder why I like ephemera so much? There we go. Because knowledge is power. You find stuff like that, and it's fascinating because you can get big bucks. There's another license plate, number 58. So again, this one actually had the body part was made. Number 58 was one that they went up to 58. So that one sold for $1,200. This I found interesting. These dealerships existed. Like, it was one of those things, if you watch the movie, it makes it seem like these people were just buying these dealerships and they were just being, cheated, that they didn't get anything out of it. You could have had a dealership for a full year. And so during that time, you could order the license plate mounts, so that when you get a license plate mount today showing that you got your car from a Chevy dealership or, Aurora Auto Mall or whatever, they had a Tucker. And this goes back to your question, Katie. So this auto company also sold Crossley. Are those cars or those tires? I think they're cars. Anyway, so wherever Kinswa, Pennsylvania is, they had planned to have a Tucker dealership, and these never would have gotten used, or maybe they got used if they sold on a Crossley, but they wouldn't be common, and they're $1,000. So
Man, that is super cool.
it's basically look for the name Tucker on just about anything, and if you can attach it to the Tucker Automobile Organization in the right time frame, you are going to be very happy.
Cheryl's
Cheryl.
asking if that was the only magazine that Tucker ran the ad and ran any ads in.
I'm unclear. I had a very, very difficult time finding that original ad. I rewatched the movie in preparation to do this, and there was a reference when they talk about that ad. There's a like the way the movie's done. There's kind of a voiceover, like a narrator, and the narrator says he had a buddy of his do a concept art, and he bought an ad in Pick magazine. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I went hunting for Pick magazine, and that's how I found it. I literally could not find that ad anyplace else. I don't think the Torpedo ad was run particularly a lot, but there was like a full article and ad spread done in Life magazine. That's fairly common. That had Tucker ads, and then the other ads that I showed. But the Torpedo one, I literally only know of it in the Pick magazine, and then that brochure, which was really a sales brochure, not an ad. Those are the only references that I know where that concept art got used. So we had a press release of the illustration that came up to as $770, but that was just a copy of the art. And that's the other thing to be on the lookout for is if it's a photo versus if it's a drawing. If it's a photo, well, then it's probably of the Tucker, and it's still going to be worth something. But if somebody tries to tell you they have a photo of the Torpedo, they're lying because it never got made. Now, there was the Ida something did a recreation of the car with Preston's great-grandson, and there was a lot of press about that, like around 2010. But those were always very clearly like it was a much later model. It looks different. They're not trying to compete with anything. It was just kind of to get the Preston Tucker name out there again. But this one you can even see without me opening it. It's got that really sharp edged front, and then the fenders are independent. So they're calling that a press release photo. Well, it's not a photo, it's an illustration. It's a photo of an illustration. Here's the Tucker heater. Open that up because I can't remember. That might say Tucker on the front of it, but like I said, the luggage did not. But the heater, like I don't know why anyone would collect the heater other than just to be, I want everything I can have from the Tucker Corporation. Because I don't think it says, it's just who makes the heater. So if you have the box, it would say it was a Tucker heater. But this same heater probably went into other cars of the era. There wouldn't have been anything special necessarily about it. But
that's why I wonder how you prove with those things that they actually are Tucker.
Yeah, so this one, extremely rare piece. Heater's exact same heater. It's still great shape, beautifully restored. I do not have the original box it was shipped in. That would make me wonder. It's like, okay, you know the story, but if you don't have the box, I would be worried. So they're saying there's a story about 50 Tuckers, the parts were auctioned off, but they're not saying that's how they got them. So it's either a case where you need to ask questions or know your seller. If this was like Billy Bob's junk store, there ain't no way in hell I'm spending $750 for a heater that they claim to be a Tucker. But if it's the Auburn Auto Museum and they have it from a collector, I would probably put more stock in it. So it's always worth asking questions. This gets into another area that I find interesting because it's also just a really unique and very limited window.
Ooh.
You've got the actual body plate that would have been engraved with that serial, that body number. So like 1050, it would actually say 1050. So most of them, just as you would expect, they bought them not necessarily in bulk. They would have bought more than they needed. This one has not been used. So there probably are at least hundreds of them, if not thousands of them, because why would they've only bought 50? They would have had a box of them or a case. So this one sold for $676, but it also includes were these name badges? Well, it says that they're also serial ID plates. I'm not sure what the brass ones were for, the M184 and the E377. So those must have been used at some point because they say right on their Tucker Corporation. So they were used for something. But there's also something that will pop up is there are employee name badges. So those can sometimes come up with value, particularly if it's a name that's important. But so this was a set. It has a set. It's sold $676. But if you just saw that in a garage sale, if you didn't know Tucker or recognize the Tucker Corporation, you would think that'd be worth like $10. You wouldn't think there was significant value to that. So again, those said that they had the Chicago date on them. You're seeing some Hot Wheels, but I will show them later. This one was, I was going to say, I thought the badges. So this, even it doesn't have a name. It has the employee's worker ID. So I don't know how they named people, but again, it says the Tucker Corporation. It's got the pin back. It's somehow identified an employee. So that sold for $575. I mean, so basically anything you can come across. Again, another illustration of the early rendering of it. Anything you can come across that has the Tucker name is going to get you some bucks. Here's one of the ads. So this was a flyer that claims it was for the Stockholders Association. So maybe that makes it a little bit more rare because I don't know who this would have been distributed to, but $448, just for a piece of paper. So there's just a lot of stuff you can get into in the collecting, and it's because of that Tucker, and because if you can attach it to the right window of time, you're going to get the value out of it. So I think I showed you that already. This is what the radio looked like. I kind of showed it before, so it's got the Tucker name spelled out. This is all the way back in 2013. It sold for $335. This I could see a Tucker collector wanting because it's obviously a Tucker piece. But that is, but again, it was a while ago, so that's probably worth quite a bit more now. But even back then, it was several $100. I also though wanted to point out that there are going to be Tucker reproductions, and I'm not going to claim that this is trying to be a fake, but they have attached a December 1949 calendar to it. So at a glance, be like, oh, cool, Tucker did calendars. All right, well. How many times have you heard Katie and I teach you about zip codes? Right here, it has a Chicago address, but it has a 5-digit zip code with the 4 extension. 5-digit zip codes were not introduced until 1963. This cannot be a legitimate Tucker 48 ad. Now, if you read where I pulled this from, it says in honor of Tucker. Like it never says at the reproduction, but like it's vague enough that they're not, and they're being honest, at least with the zip code, but there could be people out there that are putting things like this. I don't think she would be dressed like that in 1948. That'd be my personal opinion, but you could find someone who's a little bit smarter trying to fake this because at a glance, other than the fact that she's in pleather, this could be a legitimate calendar. So
and
just
consider that a fantasy item, Patrick.
It's definitely something that was produced. Like, I don't know why they're doing it for 1949. What bothers me about it is I do feel they're trying to do it to not to fraud somebody, but specifically to cheat somebody, because look, they have pages ripped off of it. So there's no reason you would create a fake calendar like this, even if it's just for giggles, but then actually start ripping pages off of it to make it look like it was used throughout the year 1948. So I don't even consider this a fantasy item. I consider this a fraudulent piece, but they gave themselves away by putting in the 5-digit zip code. So they're stupid fraudulent, but it's out there.
Judy's asked if that movie is on Netflix.
Well, funny you should ask, Judy, because if you look at the next tab, I'm about to get to there. I'm going to show this one item first, and then I will answer your question, Judy. This is then, like, everybody can get their hands on this. This is the Tucker Torpedo Hot Wheel that was created from 2009 to 2012. You can pick these up for under $10. They have multiple variations, multiple colors. If you remember my triptych on Hot Wheels, we talked about the Spectra Flame Glaze. Glaze, they actually brought it back. So you can see it's got the metallic tint to it. It was available from 2009 to 2012. So fairly regularly available. And the ones that were showing up on Worth Point, the only reason they were showing up as huge value was because they were sets of like 50 or 100, so they were coming up with big values. Individually, this does not sell for all that much. So these are fairly easy to find. So I might be on the hunt for one of those because I think they're cute. But that is available. So that's kind of the low end of collecting. So high end, buy yourself a Tucker. Can't find a real Tucker? Buy a little baby Tucker.
Interesting T-shirt advert there on your.
Yeah, I was noticing.
Oh. All right, we're going to move on to the next thing. So this is the movie. So Jeff Bridges, Francis Ford Coppola film, Tucker and His Dream. As it so happens, it is available for free on YouTube right now. So I don't know how long it'll be for free, but you can go to YouTube and watch this for free. You get ads, but you still get it for free. I have it on Amazon Prime, but I had to buy it. And it does pop up on Netflix on occasion, but is not currently on Netflix. So this one is available on YouTube right now, free with ads. And if you watch the movie or you've seen the movie before and you really enjoy it, also completely coincidentally, the American Transportation Experience at the AACA Museum is having a virtual talk about the Tucker movie, what's real and what's not, coming up next week, January 22nd from 11 a.m. to 12:30. They are on the East Coast, so this would be Eastern time. They are having Preston Tucker's grandchildren talk about the production of the movie and talk about what was different, about what was changed for the movie, what was real, what was not. I will probably not participate in this, but I thought I came across it when I was researching it, and I thought it was fascinating that this was popping up at the same time I was talking about it on the Triptych. So this is available at the AACA Museum website coming up on January 22nd. It's a virtual talk, so it shouldn't be canceled. And it starts at 11 a.m. Eastern on January 22nd. So that is Tucker.
Wow, that was fascinating, Patrick. I learned
very
so much.
Yeah, it was a really fun one to research. Like I said, a lot of it did kind of stem off the movie. I felt like what I knew about Tucker, I knew from the movie. A friend of mine, actually a deep dive I did about a year or so ago, I did a deep dive with the fountain pen guy, Nathaniel Cerf from the Pen Collector. Cerf his uncle worked for the Tucker Corporation. And he is actually depicted in the movie in a very short scene. But if you look there, they go into a guy's office and the name on the guy's office is Cerf. So it's that there's like a little fascinating, like very tangential connection that, a buddy of mine has an uncle that's, was tied to the Tucker Corporation. But beyond that, I've never owned a Tucker. I've seen one in real life. Of course, I've never driven one. But I just find the story fascinating because the movie to me is very much like I joke that he's a huckster, but the idea behind the movie is almost getting into, it's like it's like, Ayn Rand, Fountainhead, type situation that somebody should be allowed to succeed and he can't. And like, why can't he succeed? And so it's just, to me, it is a fascinating story. And I was even more fascinated. I found out what the facts were that kind of argued against what the movie depicted. But I'm glad you guys enjoyed it because it's kind of a niche-y thing. A lot of people have not heard of Tuckers because, again, they're only around for a short period of time. But, I know a lot of people that join the show and even watch it afterwards, they're collectors or, resellers. This is, again, all of these are designed to be knowledge is power. And we're trying to educate you guys, everyone, as best as possible to just say, here's what you don't know what you don't know. So here's like 10 pieces of information. You'll probably retain one or two of them. But, we hear examples all the time. People go out into the wild after watching one of our shows and suddenly stumble across whatever it is we talked about. So, here's hoping you guys go into your next antique mall and find a Tucker stock certificate or a Tucker ashtray and realize that something that maybe that seller didn't.
Which is fascinating because that always happens. It's right after we do something like this that we end up coming across an item, and always we'll have a fun be on the lookout after these. Absolutely.
So thanks everyone for joining in tonight. Appreciate hosting the Triptych again. We've got the next Triptych will be coming up next week, and in our rotation, Katie will be hosting that. But what do you have coming up on your channel before that? I think you've got a collaboration coming up soon, don't you?
I do. I'm really excited about this collaboration. So I'm working with Beth over at Carolina Sweet Treats and Pretties and Dolores from Miss DAM Jewelry. And we are trying to bring back the clear glass. So all that clear glass that's sitting dusty on the bottom of a shelf at a thrift store, it needs to come back because it is gorgeous. And so we are hosting that collaboration. It will be coming out this Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern across all channels that are participating in it. There will be a playlist linked down below in the video that I did for that collaboration. And there is still time to join in on that if you want to film a video or do an Instagram post. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it will be fun and a great way to show the many uses of clear glass.
I just filmed all my pieces of it. I just filmed the voiceover to it, and now I have to edit the video. So I only have a day and a half left to do it, but I will get it done. So I will get that posted. So that's excellent. And then Wednesday, Katie and I are doing our duo dives. Those are always on Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. This week, the duo dive will also be on my channel. So you come back to this channel, join me Wednesday, 9:30 p.m., and I will be hosting Katie. It will be just a duo dive between the two of us, and Katie will be showcasing her collection, some of her collection of hats, but the focus will be on the little mini hat collections that she's developed. She showcased several of these, she got some over Christmas, and she will be showcasing the mini hats and how some of the companies that issued them actually use them as gift cards to turn in for regular hats. So I am actually really looking forward to that one. And that'll be on my channel at 9:30 Eastern on Wednesday. And then I'll have my sale Thursday night as well. So, and that'll be, I'm still at the late night. So my sale Thursday night will be 11 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays. So thanks everyone for joining in tonight. I appreciate if you have any questions about this triptych, past triptychs, look in our playlists. I have a playlist specifically for the triptychs as well as my deep dives, which includes the duo dives, or reach out to any of us for questions or even suggestions on topics that you want to see covered, possibly in future triptychs and or duo dives. So thanks everybody for joining in. Thank you once again, Katie and Nate, for joining with me and completing the triptych. And we will talk to everyone again soon. Everyone have a great night. Thanks for putting your trust in Trusty Huckster. Bye, everybody.
Bye, friends.